You mentioned corruption. I want to ask you about Hillary Clinton. Okay, how corrupt is Hillary Clinton, or how corrupt are the Clintons?
Well, there's two branches to the Democratic Party. One is the corrupt branch and one is the Marxist branch. And the Clinton Biden have been in a nexus for about 30 years.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Daniel Estulan, and welcome to Estulan.media. Well, Wikipedia, actually, not WikiLeaks, calls my next guest a U.S. businessman and a conspiracy theorist. His name is Patrick Byrne, and he's one of the most fascinating, if not the most fascinating character. And I met some very fascinating, very strange people in my life. But he is, bar none, number one. We're going to talk about his latest book, which I, finished in one sitting in about 2.5 hours. Danger Close, Domestic Extremist #1 Comes Clean. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show. The most fascinating person, bar none, I've ever met in my life. Before we go, we're going to talk about this in parts. How do you go from Wall Street golden boy to domestic extremist threat #1? I mean, it just blows your mind. How do you do that?
Good mother, I guess. My good mother. My good mother. So basically I got mixed up in the national security state and used to set up some stings. Barack Obama, James Comey, and John Brennan were taking over the government, and I created a sting on them, and it's all been verified. How I got there was I was a CEO of a public company. I became aware of I became aware of some mischief on Wall Street. I went and reported in like 2002 to 2005. I reported to the authorities, and I was shocked at how indolent our government was. And I started forming this impression that our government was actually either asleep at the switch or in bed with Wall Street. And I started really making corruption, the study of corruption, the centerpiece of my life. And that's how I went from being a golden boy to that's the first step I took. And I was used by the government. I mean, I helped the government put together a bunch of crimes going on Wall Street. And in 2009, they brought 2009 and 2010, they brought something like 120 indictments against people. And I had something to do with some of that. And I had been helping them as much as I could. And then, so that's really that. And then that help led to other assignments, but that led to bribing Hillary Clinton. And then I discovered the bribery of Hillary Clinton was really just for blackmail purposes.
We're going to get to Hillary Clinton in a second. I can't wait to hear that. Politically speaking, what are you? Are you a Democrat? Are you a conservative, a communist, nihilist? What are you?
I'm really a small R Republican, a small L libertarian. The easiest way to say it is Milton Friedman was my great hero and friend. And when Milton Friedman died, about 3 weeks before he died, he called me and he asked me to take over his foundation upon his death. He said that it was scheduled to dissolve. The name was going to dissolve at his death, but he changed his mind and wanted me to lead in his name for 10 years. So to 99% of the world, that wouldn't boil an egg, but to 1% of the world, it means something. That Milton Friedman, in the last month of his life, called me and said, I want to give you my name for 10 years. You lead in my name. So to me, it was like Isaac Newton had called me, but to 99% of the world, it doesn't mean a thing.
How profitable is corruption? How many mouths does it feed? Because in the United States, the law is the United States government, they're honest and decent and good people, and they watch out for everybody out there. Their job is to make sure that they, dismantle corruption the world over. But how corrupt is, let's start, at home, ground zero. How corrupt is the U.S. government?
It's shockingly corrupt. It's been infiltrated. It's been infiltrated. It is shockingly corrupt. Really, I have to, and I'm not an Obama hater. I didn't start off as an Obama hater, but when it's really, Obama was part of a corrupt coup against our country. And I know that because I worked for him. I was used on his orders to do things. So it's shockingly corrupt, and we have fallen out of the top 10 in terms of the rankings of corruption. We were last year, I think, down to 18, and then the new rankings have come out, and I think we're like in the 40s or something, aren't we? You should look that up. I think we're not even in the top cleanest 40 countries. were shockingly corrupt. And people haven't figured out the real truth. Even as corrupt as people are seeing it now, it's more corrupt than they know. And that corruption includes to our election system. I did not vote for Donald Trump, but I was the first in the country to come out after that election and say this whole election is corrupt. It's been rigged. And I've spent the last 3.5 years digging into that.
We're going to talk about the election interference, and not only in the United States, but the world over, especially Venezuela, the elections which were held on the 28th of July. Now, so government is corrupt. The intelligence agencies, I imagine, are corrupt. The DEA, the CIA, et cetera, et cetera. If you were to say, like, top 3 most corrupt agencies in America, what would be like the top 3?
Well, the FBI, sadly, and instead of speaking of what agencies, I'd say what levels, and I can tell you exactly where it's corrupt.
Okay.
And how it happened, and it's really the thing people should know. Like all countries, we in the Soviet Union, they used to call it commissars. So you have the bureaucracy of some department, but then there's a political commissar over it who makes sure that the department's running per. It may not even be the official head of the department, but it's somebody that's made. In our country, our system is like, we don't call them commissars, but we have that. The new president comes in and about 2,000 people get appointed across the government.
Right.
It was for 2 centuries a tradition that if you got appointed to one of those positions over, and I'm not just talking about the number one, the secretary, I'm talking about all the other political appointments at the top. There's 2,000 of them, maybe 1,500, that the tradition was for 2 centuries that you served your time and then you moved on. You did not take a job in the bureaucracy because you didn't really earn it. You got there as a political appointee, and so you want people bubbling up because of talent and moving up from within. Well, about 30 years ago, well, actually during World War II, that got broken. There were 2 senators, I think their names were something like Ram and Spec, because the verb is to ram spec in. And it means when a person gets appointed to the top somewhere as a political appointee, and then over time, he digs into the bureaucracy and makes it a permanent job, that is called ram specking in to the federal government. And it was really frowned on. It was a taboo kind of thing, not a law. And then about 30 years, I think it may have been under George Bush, but it was certainly by Clinton, that taboo started being broken openly. And so we start having people getting to the top, not because they were great DEA officers or not because they were great in the State Department or in some other
Not because they were smart.
They were good because they went to Brown and they studied sociology, and their daddy's a car dealer from Phoenix and gave some money to the presidential candidate. And they get appointed, and then even when the guy who appointed them leaves, what they do is they get in that position, and in that position they open up, they create a job in the bureaucracy, and then they apply for it themselves, and they take a step down into the bureaucracy, but now they've become a civil servant. So now you have a whole layer, a crust across the top of the federal bureaucracy that are these people who got there. And listen, it's Democrats and Republicans have been doing this for over a generation. And there's a reason there was a taboo for it. Because again, instead of getting to the top now by talent, you can be one of these political flunkies who ram specs in. So now across our government, we have a layer of people. I think it's probably 1,000 plus or minus 500 who are not talented. They're political hacks. I think it's probably 2/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, but both of them, it's a bad idea for both of them. And that's what's happened in our government. You have these political hacks who've taken over the bureaucracy, and that's really the swamp.
What about so if the government is corrupt and the intelligence, you mentioned the FBI. Okay, so FBI would be one. But how corrupt is the CIA? How corrupt is the DEA? I mean, we're seeing so much stuff coming up right now about the corruption of the DEA, but how corrupt are the other 16, 17 agencies in the government structure?
Well, I've heard it, when it comes to the CIA, I've heard it 2 ways. I've heard it said that, Patrick, at the top of the CIA, it's all deep state, but it's different flavors of deep state. is different flavors. On the other hand, I've also heard it say that in the least, that in some sense, it's less corrupt because there's only 2 people at the top of the CIA who are political appointees. I've also been told this, that yeah, so it's got these different highly ideological factions, but they're not political appointees. I don't know what the truth is about the CIA. I've had kind of a lifelong prohibition. As I explained in my book, I did something for the US government in 1988 in Vietnam, when it was a Soviet client state. And as a result of that, it was a humanitarian mission, and the Vietnamese government were aware of it. And they cooperated with me to figure out how the US could do some humanitarian things for Vietnam. But because of that, the Soviets in 1988 learned that I was,
yeah, right.
so because of that, I've never had any association with the CIA itself. But I've had lots of associations with other parts of government, and from them kind of heard these stories. And that's the story I've been told about the CIA. I can tell you one agency that's turned out to be pretty good. I mean, very good, or from, well, first the people in the FBI, and I've cooperated with law enforcement, especially against Wall Street. I can tell you, they're good people. They tend to have backgrounds as lawyers and accountants, which makes them limited in a certain way, but they are good people. It's the schmucks at the top, and not just DC. A lot of the worst guys in the FBI got sent out to Utah and sat out the whole Trump administration. So a lot of really bad players were out in Utah.
Oh, we're talking about the Mormons, of course. Utah.
Well, some of the people sent there weren't Mormons. There was, but no, who I've actually come to have a lot of respect for are the DHS employees, because the DHS, I didn't know this until a year ago. The DHS hires people out of, everyone there has basically been a city cop who made detective. Now, if you've ever worked with the police, you ever notice in the movies how cops are always detectives are kind of represented as being quirky and eccentric?
Yes.
That's because they're smart. They're the really smartest people that figure things out. You're not a flatfoot, just, stopping drunks from fighting.
You're not the beat cop. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're a detective, it turns out detectives, I've never met a dumb detective. I've never met an average detective. Detectives are all real sharp. And they're correct. So that they tend to be eccentric people from what I've seen, and so how the DHS works is once you make detective in some state or local city police force, I think you have to be a detective for like 5 to 8 years. Then you apply and become a federal, if you're accepted by the DHS.
Department of Homeland Security agent, yeah.
Yeah, so the DHS agents are like, they're all very successful detectives, and they're real sharp, and they're quirky, but they're really sharp. And it's a different kind of person, and the FBI selects people who are very square, and they tend to be accountants and lawyers. But and I love them. They're just fine. They got some bad people up top, but the agents are fine. But in the DHS, it seems to me, from what I've been encountering, that the entire there's just a bunch of detectives who got federalized, and man, they're sharp and they're action oriented. Like, they're not sitting around writing history papers. They're action oriented people. So and you can look this up as well, that the FBI has 35,000 people, I think, in it. The DHS has 270,000. So people don't realize this. The DHS
It's a big agency. It's a big agency. Yeah, you mentioned Hillary Clinton.
And they're really smart.
You mentioned
the FBI guys are smart too, but the DHS guys are like action-oriented people. They're detectives who are now federal, and they're into action. They're not bureaucrats.
You mentioned corruption. I want to ask you about Hillary Clinton. Okay, how corrupt is Hillary Clinton, or how corrupt are the Clintons?
Well, there's 2 branches to the Democratic Party. One is the corrupt branch, and one is the Marxist branch. And the Clinton-Biden have been in a nexus for about 30 years. It's the Clintons and Bidens together. They're pure corruption.